Welcome to Windows on the World. This live stream is one of our weekly shows. Our weekly shows are now going to be weekly, but not on any particular date. I've decided to bring you the information when I have it. And each of these shows is a special within itself. So we're not commenting on the news cycle. We're giving you information which you can look at for years to come, because the archive hopefully will be there for a long time. And that's the whole idea of this. It's a lifelong learning project. And this particular show is about Tartaria, the real versus the fake, the implanted conspiracy theory versus the truth. And it's always the two lies. So we have to work out what is in between the two lies. And in between the two lies, we usually find the facts. So there's the real versus the stated goals, and the real history is no different. The real history is covered up for political reasons, and I've been uncovering that for quite a long time. As you know, we've been doing quite a few shows on the works of William Comyns Beaumont and other historians. And yeah, where have all the good researchers gone? People like Eustace Mullins, Bill Cooper, even Michael Hoffman, David Irving. David Irving's History of Britain is absolutely brilliant, and of course pretty much written out of history because he talked about the wrong thing at the wrong time. But this is where the real people are separated from the fake. The real people want the real truth. The clickbait conspiracy theorists are happy with fantasy history. And we see that a lot on the internet, don't we? So Tartaria, the real Tartaria, was a massive landmass which covered all of modern day Russia, went to China, down to India, and what was called Mongolia. We're going to get into that as we go along. We're going to be talking about Anatoly Fomenko, who is a member of the Russian Academy of Sciences. He is an artist and historian, and he started finding old maps which told a very different story. Now, we've talked about how land masses have actually had their names changed. Look at modern day Israel, for example. Those names are new names. They are not from the times of the biblical history which they are supposed to represent. And as we look at land masses all over the world, we find this. So it wasn't just the Romans that changed the names of places and named them. For instance, you know, modern day Romania was Dacia, then we had Thrace. These were massive areas. And then we found out that we had massive movements of people who were interconnected civilizations that went across all of these areas and right up to the Indus Valley. So we talked about the Vincha culture. We also talked about the Scythians, who went all the way through what's known as the Asian steppe, which came originally from Persia all the way up to the Indus Valley through Mongolia, even into modern day Ukraine. So when we talk about civilizations rising and falling, maybe we should be thinking more about civilizations integrating and conglomerating. This makes a lot more sense. And this is really what Anatoly Fomenko is saying in his writings and in the historical evidence that he gives with the maps, and the maps do tell the story. So we've got this real history which has been covered through misinformation, and hence we get this fake Tartaria which took off about 5 to 10 years ago. And it dates back, really, this kind of thing, to the British intelligence services of old, because this is really, when you think about it, an imperialist way of saying there was no greater civilization than ours. And of course, every civilization has done this. They want to say that they were the first. Well, in this case, the cover-up was quite recent, but this idea of ancient Tartaria is very real. And indeed, there is an independent republic state in Russia today called Tartaria. There's also a village in modern day Romania called Tartaria, and this is where the Tartaria tablets were found, which actually link together this runic form of symbolism, which seems to date back at least 20, 30,000 years, probably a lot more. And that's the sort of stuff we've been talking about over the last few weeks. So go back and have a look at those shows. But this new Tartaria has been really lapped up by the gullible, and it gained traction in the conspiracy circus because these are the people who don't really want evidence. They want to see something and go, wow, that fits with this new theory, which I've just heard on the internet. So to go to Wikipedia, the description of this is actually quite accurate. Wikipedia is okay for some things, not for most though. But it says on the Wikipedia page that this modern Tartaria, this conspiracy theorist Tartaria, describes a certain period of history. And the idea is that it takes away the idea of this huge empire and huge mass of people. So let's see what the fake Tartaria psychological operation is actually all about. This is from Wikipedia. It says the Tartarian Empire is a group of pseudo-historical conspiracy theories. Well, actually, it's very real because we've got the maps to prove it. And one of them was actually the thumbnail for this show. And those maps are from the 1700s, before really the Romanovs took over the narrative of Russian history, what became Russian history. So yeah, the Tartarian Empire is actually not a group of pseudo-historical conspiracy theories. It was a real empire. It says, including ideas of a hidden past and mud floods, which originated as pseudo-scientific Russian nationalism. Now, this is very clever in a way, but it's clever if you're an idiot, but it's not clever if you know how the intelligence services operate. So when they say pseudo-scientific Russian nationalism, what they've actually done is they've denigrated the idea that there was ever a Tartarian empire by saying that it is somehow associated by these buildings and places in the West which look quite advanced for their time. Can you see how simple that is? Very obvious when you know what's behind it. So right there is the subversion. It was real history versus fake conspiracy history. Tartary, it says, or Tartaria, is a historical name for Central Asia and Siberia, and a lot more, actually, but that is correct. Actually, a vast area, though. It says conspiracy theories assert that Tartary, or the Tartarian Empire, was a lost civilization with advanced technology and culture. Well, it had a pretty advanced culture. It was not lost, but it was written out of history, Western history. And it was certainly pretty advanced because it became very powerful and dominant in that whole region. And that region is a big region. And it says here, Wikipedia carries on, this ignores well-documented accounts of Tartary within the history of Asia. In the present day, Tartary covers a region spanning central Afghanistan to northern Kazakhstan, as well as areas in Mongolia, China, and the Russian Far East. So they're kind of contradicting themselves in the same article here, because above they didn't say it covered this huge area. So the whole article here is misinformation. It says the background. The theory of Great Tartaria as a suppressed lost land or civilization originated in Russia. Well, it was a Russian man that actually dug out the maps fairly recently. That much is true, with aspects first appearing in Anatoly Fomenko's New Chronology in the mid-70s and early 1980s, and was then popularized by the racial occult history of Nikolai Levashov. In Russian pseudoscience, known for its nationalism. Well, this is great, isn't it? So you've got the Western imperial powers saying that Russian pseudoscience is actually based on its nationalism. Well, that is the pot calling the kettle black, isn't it? That's incredible chutzpah. Tartaria is presented as the real name for Russia, which was maliciously ignored in the West. Now, that isn't true. It was just written out of history by the Russian royal families. It was written out by the monarchy because they wanted to change the names of the landmass. And of course, it changed on the map. So it's nothing to do with what they're saying here. And even if you have a cursory glance through Fomenko's work, that is completely obvious. So here we have obvious and pro-imperial Western propaganda. And now the bit for the gullible. The globalized version of the conspiracy theory is based on an alternative view of architectural history. Well, that's the conspiracy theory that's been implanted by the West. It has nothing to do with the real Tartaria, which was a real place with real architecture. So adherents, it says, propose that demolished buildings such as the Singer Building, the original New York Penn Station, and the temporary grounds of the 1915 World's Fair in San Francisco were actually the buildings of a vast empire based in Tartary that has been suppressed by history. Now, only an idiot would believe that, because Tartary, they've just told you where it was. So these buildings from 1915, the World's Fair, why would that have anything to do with stuff that was pre-1700s? You have to be a complete idiot. And I think this is a problem, actually, with the new conspiracy clown media, that they all jump on the same thing at the same time and they talk about it without doing any research into it. And that is why I long for the days or the emergence of people who are serious about what they do, because it's getting pretty thin on the ground information, that is. But it's always there, as we've proved in these shows, and there's no reason to repeat garbage. In fact, one should refrain from doing it at all costs, but they don't. So that was the misinformation to discredit the real history, which we're going to get onto in this show. It says sumptuously styled Gilded Age buildings are often held out as really having been built by the supposed Tartaria. Well, you know who they're built by. You can find the architects. If they're talking about things from the 1900s or the 1800s, well, you can easily find out. This is neoclassical stuff, isn't it? It's always been popular. Neoclassical architecture was used in communist countries in the 80s. I mean, it goes back to the Pantheon, it goes back to the Romans, but then it goes into these decorated buildings, of course, and this romantic area, the Gothic area throughout the whole of Europe, really, especially Romania, Czech Republic. These are masterpieces of Gothic architecture, which we don't see anymore. Of course, the great age of cathedral building. Why aren't they mentioning this? Are they going to call that Tartaria? You see, this is the mixing up of very obvious history for people who don't think at all. However, it says other buildings, such as the Great Pyramids and the White House, are further held out as Tartarian constructions. Well, the White House is, again, neoclassical, isn't it? It's meant to look like Greek. I mean, you have council buildings in the UK that look like that, like the White House. Your buildings all over Europe that look like that. There is nothing very special about that. So this is really a very dumb cover story for something which is actually very, very real. It says the conspiracy theory only vaguely describes how such a supposedly advanced civilization, which had reputedly achieved world peace, could have fallen and been hidden. Well, that doesn't make sense at all, because we're talking about Mongolia. We're talking about Genghis Khan here. Khan meaning king. The Mongol hordes, the Golden Hordes. These were real. They succeeded because of their superior knowledge of geolocation and war and putting the two together. That is why the so-called Mongol hordes were so successful, because they knew their territory, they knew their enemy, they were brilliant with horses, and they were fantastic archers. They could really pick people off whilst going very, very fast on horses. And this was the reason they were successful. Nothing to do with what they're saying here, how a supposedly advanced civilization which had reputedly achieved world peace could have fallen and been hidden. Well, peace was achieved in these huge areas. But of course, there were wars and there was tribal conflict. We all know that. It says proponents of the theory also frequently claim that Tartarians have developed unlimited wireless energy. See, now it's getting into the lost technology of the ancients nonsense, isn't it? Which actually isn't nonsense, but it has spawned so many people talking nonsense. And that's the issue. So it says, yes, the Tartarian Empire is typically attributed to a colossal mud flood. What? So buildings from 1915 disappeared in a mud flood. What are they talking about? I mean, the whole thing's so contradictory and silly. When I heard people talking about this, I thought they were talking about the real Tartaria. And then I thought, what are they actually talking about? Because it was so retarded. I just couldn't get my head around it. So I hope this is helping people who've had this in the back of their mind for a while, trying to clarify it here. So yes, when in fact what happened was it was clearly assimilated into what is now modern day Russia, then the Soviet Union, now its satellite states, of course, involving what we call modern day Russia. And all this, of course, came from the Rus Empire, which goes back. I mean, we're talking about official Russian history, where they're talking about the Cyrillic, which goes back to 700 to 800 AD, I think. It says, in the conspiracy theory, the idea that a mud flood wiped out much of the world via depopulation, and thus old buildings, this is common, supported by the fact that many buildings across the world have architectural elements like doors, windows, and archways submerged many feet below ground level. Well, that's subsidence and flooding. That happens all over the world. Both World War I and II are cited as a way in which Tartaria was destroyed and hidden, reflecting the reality that the extensive bombing campaigns of World War II did destroy many historic buildings. Well, that's just a fact, isn't it? The general evidence for the theory is that there are similar styles of building around the world, such as capitol buildings with domes or star forts. And they're mixing up two different things here. Star forts have nothing to do with capitol buildings with domes. Again, that's neoclassical. That's going back to ancient Greece or way beyond that. There was no real such thing as ancient Greece. We've gone through that in previous shows. But this is where they lump everything together. And then conventional theory becomes a problem, conventional history. And the academic gulag is literally stuck in the mud. It says also, many photographs from the turn of the 20th century appear to show deserted city streets in many capital cities around the world. So what? When people do start to appear in the photographs, there's a striking contrast between horse and cart users in the muddy streets and the elaborate, highly ornate stone megastructures that tower above the inhabitants of the cities, which is seen even in modern cities where extreme poverty is contrasted with skyscrapers. Well, if you go to parts of Eastern Europe, you will see horses and carts and modern skyscrapers side by side. So there's nothing unusual about that at all. So that is the unreality of a conspiracy theory. That was actually a paper by Demos, which we debated them on about 10 years ago, the unreality of conspiracy theories. But they found out that what they were saying were conspiracy theories were actually borne out by facts that they didn't know about, and they lost the argument. Those were the days. We don't get things like that anymore, but it can still be done and should be done, and everything should be challenged, but in a methodical and perfectly reasonable kind of way. So now let's get on to the reality. The land of Tartar, the Mongols, the Cossacks, the Golden Horde, all the same empire. Is this the dismissal of ancestry and history together? Is this conspiracy theory the dismissal of ancestry and history? Yes, it is. Absolutely. So the Golden Hordes, the Mongols, the regular Russian army is actually what they were called. The Russian army used to be called the Horde. This is where we get the Golden Horde from. This is where we get the Genghis Khan armies from in the 1200s. They came from what was known as the Horde. The Horde was just a name for the army. And of course, it got taken into the history books in the West as being the name for these savages that went around brutally killing and raping and pillaging everywhere they went, when in actual fact, there's an element of truth in that. But the evidence of civilization and, yes, indeed, an advanced culture is much more historically proven. So the word horde was later demonized by modern historians. Independent Tartary was the name of this huge area. Chinese Tartary was the name of Chinese Tartary. Tartary near Tibet was Lesser Tartary. The Crimea and the south and east of Ukraine were all part of this Tartarian Empire, the Grand Tartarian Empire, as we can see from the maps from the 1700s. Independent Tartary was shown on maps by the Russian Academy of Sciences in 1737. If you want to see the maps, I'll probably put up an article with the maps that I've got, but you can download Anatoly Fomenko's books online. The PDFs are there. The one I downloaded is 640 pages, and it goes into all sorts of different areas, which are really tying in with this, not so much the covering up of history, but the erasing of history and the negligence of modern day historians. That's a lot to do with it. The laziness and negligence of modern day historians. So Lithuania, previously Belarusia, also known as Zamatia. So the area called Lithuania is actually a new construction because it was the Belarus who were living there originally, and they spoke the original Russian language. This is according to Fomenko's research again. Present Lithuania was known as White Russia or Moscovia. Now, if you look on the map, you can see Moscovia on the map on that thumbnail. That was the part of Great Tartaria at the very top of Russia. So the Tartars and the Mongols, they ruled in a period of military history in what is now modern day Russia, previously the Soviet Union, ruled by the Khan or later the Tsar. So we know about the Tsars of Russia, but the Khans, meaning kings, were actually all part of this empire too. And I always found this really odd because I knew people who were descendant of the tribes of Genghis Khan, because Genghis Khan conquered and assimilated many tribes. And a lot of the people you get through India and China were part of these Genghis Khan tribes. In fact, there is a theory on the internet, which is a conventional theory, that 1 in 200 people in Russia, or yes, 1 in 200 people can trace their lineage to the ancestors of Genghis Khan, which is possible, I suppose. But I knew somebody who was from the tribe of Genghis Khan, and that tribe still exists. And those people are in the modern day Gurkhas. So they were always very good warriors. You've got the Rai, the Gurung, and the Chetri, 3 Nepali tribes, and they are known for their different types of skills. The Rai are known for being very fearsome warriors, and they are, according to people I know who are from that tribe, they say that they are the descendants of Genghis Khan, and they do look quite Mongolian. But this is the interesting thing, isn't it? Because when we look at the people spreading out from these Russian satellite areas into Kazakhstan and all these places, we never hear about any of these places. They're written out of history. When I was at school, you never heard anything about Eastern Europe because of the Cold War and that these countries were under communism. We were never taught anything about the history of these countries. Same with the Soviet Union. So all of that history is lost to several generations of people, and it had been covered up hundreds of years before anyway. So this is where we start looking, and the truth can be found in these old maps. And this is what I've started to find very useful in taking apart modern day Israel, finding out that the place names were implanted much later. And of course, that's what we're talking about here. So yes, the Khan or the Tsar, Genghis Khan, for instance, was Temujin Khan. He was born somewhere between Siberia and Mongolia. I don't think they know exactly where he was born. Ironically, or interestingly, recently they found what is meant to be his tomb, but he's meant to have fathered so many children that, as we say, we could all be descendant of Genghis Khan, according to the academic gulag. And what we're talking about now is during the time of Genghis Khan, there was 9 million square miles of empire, 9 million square miles. So that could not possibly be run by a couple of tribes, a couple of Mongol tribes. It had to be part of a huge empire. And that is the bit which puts the thing into perspective. Each tribe had its own land and its own belief system. So there was no totalitarian system here. This is what we were finding when we were talking about the Vinci culture, the later Scythians, the Goths. These people seemed to have integrated and conglomerated with each other. So in other words, it seems to be the academic world that has separated them. and has given them a civilization which either declined, got completely taken over, or disappeared, as with the Indus Valley culture. But the Indus Valley culture could quite easily have moved out when and if the rivers dried up and moved into these areas. So when we're talking about Mongolia, we're talking about going into China, we're going into India. These areas were all part of this greater Tartaria. And when you think about it, that's a massive area. So there has been a lot of manipulation of history going on here. So they set up their own law system. The original Silk Road, of course, was all down to these trading routes, which was set up during the time of Genghis Khan. And Khan died in 1227. And he was said to be the most successful military commander ever in some ways, because he managed to assimilate people. So it wasn't all about conquest and rape and pillage. There was quite a bit of that going on to start with, I think. This is the story of Khan. But when we look at how these people fitted into the larger area, going into India, going up into modern day Russia, into Ukraine, into Eastern Europe and down, then we can see that this starts to make sense, that this area was massive and it would be in the West's interest, in the interest of the social engineers known as the British, to ridicule this. So again, pot calling the kettle black. They talk about Russian disinformation, but the disinformation from the West dwarfs it, absolutely dwarfs it, because with a lot of the Russian stuff, you can kind of see the propaganda. You can see it, but in the Western stuff, it's just propaganda, and it's much worse now than ever was. It's retarded. It's part of the denigration of the West. So we should be thinking really about how we make civilization rise again, because I've seen it degenerate and plummet to areas I did not think it was possible for people to go into, that people have become that stupid. And I think this is why the carrying on of history and the discovering and rediscovering and reanalyzing of history is so important, because we want to, well, I'll say we, I do it from my own point of view, it's a lifelong learning project. I want to leave this planet knowing a bit more about how the world runs. And in order to do that, you have to put in the work. So the Horde, yeah, we talk about the Horde, the regular Russian army, not the Golden Horde, not the Mongol Horde. We're talking about the united armies of this area from the 15th to the 17th centuries. The last leader of the Great Horde was Boris Godunov. And the Romanovs then, according to Fomenko, really took a part in rewriting history. Well, if we look at the fake bloodlines, the fake royal bloodlines, which are all fake, of course, because they claim descent from around the time of Charlemagne, going back to King David, Saxe-Coburg, Gothas, the Habsburgs, the dynastical pretenders, really, all said that they could trace their bloodline back to David. Absolute flat out lie, that is. So there's nothing new about monarchs rewriting history. In fact, the history of Britain was pretty much written by the monarchs of the time, as we know. So there is no great surprise that during the dynasties of Romanovs, especially, this is the time when history seemed to have been really changed. The 1700s was this time, if we look at Britain, it was the time of the Enlightenment going into the 1800s. And it was a time when there was mass infiltration into the Christian ethic of what was Britain, because we had the Kabbalah coming in, we had people who were getting into this system, magical thinking, the whole new age came into the 1800s, really. And of course, then we get the Theosophists. And then we get the stories that, of course, oh, Hitler was obsessed with Madame Blavatsky. Well, he might have read one of her books. So this is all misinformation. Again, misinformation. So what we found when we looked at the history of the Sabbatean Frankists, the history of Ireland, the cult of the Kabbalah, going into the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. We're talking about a very long period of British history that has been completely rewritten. So it's not that surprising that maps from the 1700s were completely covered up. And that's what we're talking about here. So the Russian Empire, yeah, the Mongolia, Tartary, Horde, Russia, later Soviet Union, then Russian Federation, were part of a much bigger area. Now, go and have a look at the old Soviet Union and magnify that by about 3 to 4 times, and you'll have an idea of what we're talking about here. And this was a multinational group existing with other groups alongside Slavs. So the indigenous Slavs of Europe and Eastern Europe were existing alongside these other groups, the Mongols and the Tartars, for example, and later the Goths, because the story is that the Goths came in around 500 AD, wiped out the Scythians. Well, maybe they didn't. And when we look at the Scythians, they could well have been part of the Golden Horde. So we can't be absolute about where these people came from, because I've been visiting museums recently, small local museums in Europe, and people don't know anything apart from a little bit of paper that they've been given. If you try and get some more information, you will manage to get some stuff from academics, but it's very, very limited. So throughout Europe, and of course, the former Soviet Union, previously Tartaria, the history was completely wiped out by those years of communism. So from Russian communism to European communism, that's a long period of history where the history books were destroyed and rewritten. So we're not talking about some massive conspiracy here. We're talking about the eroding of history over time and for particular reasons. So the Tartars, actually, they reformed. The Tartars were the great warriors who were really fighting alongside the Khans, Genghis Khan, and they emigrated at one point to Turkey, and then they returned to Russia in the 18th century. So when we look at this and we look at these previous civilizations that swept across allegedly from Persia, well, the Aryans could have actually been from these different areas. We don't actually really know. And that's what I'm finding. The more you know, the more confusing it actually gets. So people who are very absolute about what happened in history have been through the academic gulag and told 1, 2, 3, 4, that's the way it was. But when people start studying this, especially archaeologists who've got an open mind, they're constantly finding things that are very, very surprising. And that's happening all over Europe. I get these news articles from all different archaeological institutions in different countries. They are constantly unearthing stuff that doesn't make sense. And in a lot of these former communist countries, the history is being forgotten. There are historical places which are absolutely amazing. Nobody visits them. So if you're interested in history, this is a great time to be interested in history, in my opinion, because there is so much to look into and we can find it. That's the great thing. Of course, you have to get past the conspiracy garbage, but at the misinformation, more appropriately, call it misinformation. So let's get back to this. Military maps in the 1700s. The Cossacks were referred to as the Cuban Tartars. Not Cuba as in Cuba, Kuban, the Cuban Tartars. In the 18th century, Russian maps called Constantinople or Istanbul Tsargrad. That's interesting, isn't it? That's something we never hear about. 18th century Russian maps. Constantinople had been renamed Tsargrad. Next to Saray, S-A-R-A-Y, which is a Turkish word, was located in the Russian Empire. So this place called Saray was located in the Russian Empire, and that's a Turkish name, and it united with Turkey. So they're saying that there was a conglomeration going on here, and that was pre-Ottoman. That's what I think that's what Fomenko's saying. The maps, again, are very interesting because he found a lot of maps that look as though they're from 750 AD, but they're not. He found other maps and they've just got a 1 missing. So they're actually from 1750 AD, which is where he says that history has been kind of changed. That a bit like the Beaumont stuff, where he says hundreds of years have basically gone missing. But this is very likely because when we find out about so-called lost civilizations, they're often out by hundreds and hundreds of years, if not 1,000 years. Because when they do this dating, carbon dating, etc., and there's this kind of infrared type dating. I think it's very common. They're using it a lot now. It's not that accurate. They're just guessing, really, because they've found a load of stuff which fits in with some other stuff they've found. That's basically what archaeology does. So yes, the 1755 map shows Russia in modern Ukraine and Moscovia. So if we look at the Grand Tartary map, we see Moscovia at the top. The Russian Empire was Grand or Greater Tartary, which was a massive area. And in the 1700s, Great Tartary or Grand Tartary became known as the Russian Empire to unite the people with the monarchy and the Romanov dynasty. Anatoly Fomenko started this journey around the 1980s, and I've been very impressed at his digging up these old maps, because I found some books recently myself, and they're world maps, and they show you the new and the old idea of Israel, and the whole thing looks like a complete construction. And we have gone into shows on that. But I looked at other parts of the world and it's pretty much the same, that these places have been named, renamed, and obscured. So when we're talking about somewhere, we can never be sure where we're actually really talking about. We know the present day geographical location, but we don't know that that name that it's called now was the name that it was called then. That may seem obvious. And of course, places have had their names changed. For instance, you can find a lot of villages in England and Wales. In Wales, at the time of the Great Revival, the Welsh Revival, which was this very intense period of chapel goers, and they were obsessed, really. I was looking into this a few years ago. It's very interesting. I went to some of the places, but those places were given biblical Hebrew names, you see. But this went on all over the place. So it's not just the Roman Empire that changed the names. The names have been changed so many times over thousands of years. And I think that's the key to what he's saying here, that when we're talking about this relocation of history, we're not really talking about something that's really fantastical. It's like the Commons Beaumont stuff. I mean, Beaumont's just saying that the names of the places were changed, which means that there could be places hundreds or thousands of miles away from the original place, which were just renamed. Makes absolute sense, actually, if you want to cover something up, the real history. So yeah, let's get back to this. So we've already said that the Mongol Empire, they were part of the regular army of the Golden Horde, the Horde being the regular army of Russia. Mongol Tartary dynasty was obliterated in the 1700s, and it became the Great Cossack dynasty. Mongolia, he has a theory about the word Mongolia, which is quite interesting, because there is in Eastern Europe and Russia, monogo means many, M-N-O-G-O, mosh means mighty, and monosevesto means the multitude. So that's interesting, because I've been studying linguistics and Cyrillic recently. And what's interesting about that is that the Latin, this is just an example, the Latin B and V are used for the same letters. They're not B and V, actually, in Cyrillic. But the point being that when you look at these older runic systems that were in use, that we've talked about at the times of the Scythians, then we're going back, say, we could be going back over 40,000 years. Well, these coincide with symbols that have been found throughout Europe. And a book's just come out about a common global language. And this is by an academic. So the evidence is there. And this changing of language and the origin of words is fascinating. I know there are technical terms for these things, but I'm keeping it simple. So yeah, I'm starting to get a much bigger picture of the whole of what happened sweeping through Eastern Europe and the emigrations from the north after the cataclysm of 1322 BC, which we've been covering, the origins of the Goths, the Scythians, and the Vinci culture, which is one of the most advanced cultures of its time. And that swept all the way through up to these places which were part of Great Tartaria. They have in common, for instance, these little altar tables. These are common throughout Europe, and I've seen them in museums in Eastern Europe, and they say they're about 6,000 years old. But they go all the way up to what was Tartary, Greater Tartary, Lesser Tartary, Chinese Tartary even, because these things have been found in Mongolia and the Indus Valley. This is where it linked up with the Indus Valley through the runic symbols. Somebody did a paper on it. You go back to that show we did about the Scythians. Very interesting stuff. So the first map of the Russian Empire in Europe in the 18th century was known as Grand Tartary. So Fomenko goes back to the 1700s and he shows many maps. I've got about 8 or 9 maps. If I put this into an article, I'll put them into that so you can see them all, but just look up his work. It's well worth it. So North India, the state of the great Moguls, they called it the state of the great Moguls or Mongols, meaning the great ones. Also the multitude of the great ones. Russian language spread to India, maintains Fomenko. So that's really interesting because there are letters in the Cyrillic language that do look very similar to the runic symbols used by the Scythians and people from before the Scythians. So Great Tartary included Chinese Tartary. Present-day Lithuania was Moscovia. This was in the 12th century. The Goths and the Tartars were the same nation. Now, this makes absolute sense. So all of a sudden in history, about 400 AD, the Goths start taking over everything. Very, very unlikely. The theory is that the Goths could have come from Scandinavia. They were Germanic people. Of course, this is the runic side of things, the Germanic runes and the Scandinavian runic culture, which are very, very connected. We can even go into the Icelandic Edda, which was a Scandinavian document. And then, of course, we get into the work of Augustine Waddell, and that is, I suppose, what you could call a big rabbit hole. But to me, it's not as satisfying as this, because this is real history looking at real maps. So yes, Goths and Tartaria, same people, same nation, integrated. The Tartaria Republic still exists today. You can look that up, but it does get lost with this Tartaria. See, this Tartaria conspiracy theory has actually overshadowed the real Tartaria completely on this new internet 2 we get, this AI-driven internet 2. So that tells you quite a lot, really. They're covering up the real Tartarian Empire. So the Goths are believed to have originated from southern Scandinavia, according to some academics, migrating southward to the Black Sea region, highly likely, with their early history marked by a blend of legend and scholarly interpretation. Official story. There could have been a breakaway group from the Scythians. That's the way it seems to have panned out when I was looking at it recently. The official story is the Goths were a Germanic people who played a major role in the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the emergence of medieval Europe. They were first reported by Greco-Roman authors in the 3rd century and have become very powerful by the 5th century. Then, of course, there's the Visigoths and the Vandals, all probably the same people. Because when we see this uniformity of culture that we've been discussing in these previous shows, I put this to historians and they go, you've got a good point there. Like they'd never thought of it. Incredible, isn't it? So, in summary, because I'm going to keep this fairly short, there were advanced civilizations which were not only interconnected, but cooperated for much longer than we are led to believe. Because it is not in the interests of people who make money out of wars and who make money out of financial fraud for there to be unity amongst people globally. The divide and rule aspect and the real versus the statist goals, the cover story versus the real story has worked for thousands of years. The whole point of this is that we learn about that and say, we won't get fooled again. So I'm going to leave it there for this one because I'm still looking into a lot more stuff. And as I said at the beginning, the shows will be once a week. I will announce them a couple of days before. This one went out a bit later due to unforeseen circumstances. But I will always put up the show and the date, and then it will go live and will be in the archive forevermore unless they get taken down. And they're also on Odyssey. If you want to support the show, go to windowsontheworld.net and you can support us on the homepage. You can email me at info@windowsontheworld if you want to support the show or if you have any information. And the information that I've got just from the recent shows has been fascinating. So this is a very serious group of people that are watching this now. And we seem to have lost the people who want clickbait, which is a great thing. That is very, very useful. It means there is much less distraction. So, there's someone here says, Mr. Windows dismisses Tartarian conspiracy theory with incidental criteria. No, I didn't. That's absolutely not what I said. So that's complete trolling. So we do have a troll in there. That's not what I said at all. In fact, that's the opposite of what I said. Yeah, well, never mind. We'll go beyond and above the idiots. I do find it incredible that, that you say something, make it abundantly clear, and they don't listen. And I get that still, but not as much as I used to, because this was one of the most trolled shows on the internet for the past 10 or 15 years, which is why it's very lucky when people find it. Because nobody talks about it. A little bit like the real Tartarian Empire. So thanks a lot, everybody. I'm going to check the chat now. Thanks.